I'll give you the perfect example, jobs.
Okay.
Right? There's, from the most basic common sense perspective, how could it ever possibly be wrong for the President of the United States to sit down with the CEO of any company, particularly an industrial company,
right,
and convince them to build a factory and to hire people in that factory? And on a micromanaged basis, it's impossible to see anything wrong. On a macro basis, when you ask yourself what actually is going to happen in that factory, what technologies are they going to use, what is that going to gear them towards?
You may remember right after the election, Trump, with the aid of a massive tax break, convinced the CEO of Carrier's parent company, Greg Hayes, not to move one of their factories to Mexico. He made a big deal out of saving those jobs, and he was excited about what was coming next.
They're going to spend so much money on renovating this plant. And I said, Greg, say that number. You know, he said 16 million. Well, the minimum number is 16. It's going to be, in my opinion, a lot more than that.
But here's the thing about that $16 million. It wasn't actually good news for the workers, as Greg Hayes made clear just a few days later.
We're going to make a $16 million investment in that factory in Indianapolis to automate, to drive the cost down so that we can continue to be competitive. What that ultimately means is there will be fewer jobs.
Oh, great work, Mr. President. So basically, Carrier workers are still going to lose their jobs. It's just the government now helped, for some reason, pay for the robots that will replace them.
Unless you understand how the nature of work is changing and how this acceleration of technological change is changing
away from manufacturing towards the jobs.
And not just manufacturing, right? How we process information, how we automate automation. The point being that I'd be willing to bet every single one of these companies that are building these factories, those factories, and they still should do them, right? And I think indirectly he's benefiting those companies on a macro basis, but from the macro basis for the whole country, benefiting those companies, but on the macro basis for the whole country, every one of those companies that are going to be building new factories, their net employment is going to be lower once those factories are built than he even anticipates.
The new factories will have robots where they had humans in the past.
And they're just pushing them towards further automation, right? And further use of deep learning, machine learning, et cetera, right? It's inevitable. He couldn't stop it. But the problem I'm having with it is he doesn't understand the macro issues. He thinks he's creating more jobs when in essence that's not happening. And so where we're going to be as a country is that we're going to have a lot of displaced workers. The nature of work is changing. And it's not just going to be factory workers who are displaced.
If you've heard anything about me and my campaign, you've heard that someone is running for president who wants to give every American $1,000 a month. I know this may sound like a gimmick, but this is a deeply American idea, from Thomas Paine to Martin Luther King to today. Why do we need to do it? We already automated away millions of manufacturing jobs, and chances are your job could be next. If you don't believe me, just ask an auto worker here in Detroit. How do we pay for it? Raise your hand in the crowd if you've seen stores closing where you live. It is not just you. Amazon is closing 30% of America's stores and malls and paying zero in taxes while doing it. We need to do the opposite of much of what we're doing right now, and the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. So let me share the math. $1,000 a month for every adult would be $461 million every month right here in Detroit alone. The automation of our jobs is the central challenge facing us today. It is why Donald Trump is our president, and any politician not addressing it is failing the American people.
The amount of change we're going to see over the next 5 years, 10 years, will dwarf everything that's happened over the last 30. Now we're introducing artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, neural networks, et cetera. So, and what that enables is the automation of automation, right? And so the people who were writing software, particularly at the lower end, unless you're doing these advanced things, they're gone, right? The people that would do—
Because the software's writing itself.
It's doing itself, right? It's just math. Right? All the people doing basketball analytics and saying, okay, we're going to, this is what you do in this situation. Well, you can't anticipate, you can't look at every possible iteration. People can't do that. There aren't enough people, there's not enough time. Machine learning can look at every possible and consider every possible
So
situation.
the notion is it looks at the statistics of the shots, looks at where the players were, looks at what happened in the last 3 games, and can play chess against it and see the reaction.
A programmer back in the day, so when I was writing code, it was the algorithms were if this, then that.
Right.
XOR, whatever it may be.
Right.
But you had to guess. Right? You had to use your best instance. And then it got smarter and smarter and smarter, and libraries to do bigger and better things. All that is being automated. And so now you have to know how to use that stuff. So either software works for you or you work for software, and once the software takes over, you're gone. Right? So unless you understand that, you don't understand that the nature of work is changing, the nature of employment is going to change.
Now, unfortunately, the way that the market is evolving is that more and more of us are going to struggle to outcompete software, artificial intelligence, and robots more and more, where robots are going to be able to drive a car and a truck better than us very, very soon. AI can already outperform the smartest doctors at identifying tumors on a radiology film. AI can already surpass experienced corporate attorneys at editing documents and contracts. Right now, we're trapped in this mindset where we all have to find value based upon the market's estimation of what we can do. But the market's going to turn on more and more of us very, very quickly, and has nothing to do with our merit. That radiologist went to school for a long time, but they just can't see shades of gray that the AI can, and the AI can reference millions of films, whereas the radiologist can only reference thousands. And so we have to start evolving the way we think of ourselves and our value in the society. If we rely upon the market, we're going to follow the market off a cliff. And we can already see that the market does not value many of the things that are core to human existence, like caring, nurturing, and parenting and caregiving. And I use my wife as an example. My wife is at home with our 2 boys, one of whom is autistic, and the market values her contribution at 0, whereas we all know that's nonsense and that her work is incredibly valuable and difficult. It's not just the caring and nurturing roles, it's also arts, creativity, journalism, increasingly volunteering in the community. All of these things are getting valued at 0 or near 0 and declining. We have to say, look, the market is not omniscient. The market's valuation of us and our activities and their value is something that we essentially invented, and we need to invent new ways to measure what we think is important. So we have to start getting ahead of this curve as fast as possible, and this is why I'm running for president.
And from a business, from a stock perspective, if you're in the Fortune 500, if you're an S&P 500 company, if you're in the Dow 30, right, if you're one of the bigger companies, you already know this. And in talking to a lot of these big companies, they know their workforces, and given the supply and demand of stocks, the supply is shrinking, and the demand is going up just as the economy grows. That's probably good news for stocks over the long term, but it's bad news for employment, and it's bad news for people who are disrupted.
Well, and that's part of the thing, right? Is that there's a time when GM was the largest employer, and the companies like GM was what employment looked like. If Facebook's what it looks like, the revenue per employee at Facebook is infinitely larger than any automaker could ever make or any manufacturer could make.
The difference is the time lag, right? The timeline. So what took 20 years before and then became 10 could be 5 or 3. And so when you start getting that massive amount of disruption in employment, what do? That's the whole thing he ran on, right? We're going to get you jobs. And if you last 4 years, right, the whole nature of employment is going to change. There aren't manufacturing jobs coming back. There aren't more coal mining jobs coming back. No matter what you do to the EPA, a lot of these jobs are going to be gone. Now, there's still physical things. If you do infrastructure, you can kind of, buy some time, right, spend more, get temporary jobs to build roads, build bridges, which is all fine and good, right? I think you can get a return on much of those things. But you're going to have to recognize that there are going to be more people out of work.
So to me, the fundamental shift that we have to start getting our arms around is that certain people's labor is not going to be worth enough for them to make the kind of living that is required for them to live what they would consider a good life. Look at truck drivers as an example, because I use them because they're the most clear. So you have 3.5 million truckers making about $46,000 a year. And that it's a punishing job. They're behind the wheel of this truck for up to 14 hours a day, and they're away from their families 4 days a week, and the rest of it. But their market value, with the market of their time behind the wheel, it's about $46,000 a year. Now, if 5 to 10 years from now, my friends in Silicon Valley come up with trucks that can largely drive themselves, and then we're going to go to that truck driver and say, hey, turns out your market value, like your time behind the wheel, it's not 46,000 anymore. It's 26. It's 0. It's like whatever the number is, and so there's like a change building up in our economy that the freedom to trade your labor for money to make a good living for yourself, that's actually going to end up breaking down in more and more situations where that truck driver is no less willing to trade his time. I mean, he still wants to do it. But then the freight company is going to be like, turns out your time's not worth what it was. And it's not just the trucker. It could be a radiologist who makes hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they interpret radiation films, say, I'm very willing to do this. Like, I like getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then we say, hey, turns out that AI can see tumors you can't, can refer to millions of films, not thousands, can see shades of gray that are invisible to the human eye. You lose. Like your time all of a sudden goes from worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to, let's call it, like half that or 0 or whatever the number is. And so I think that it worked for a long time when the average American could show up and say, if I'm willing to work hard and I've got a strong back, I can make a decent living for myself and my family. Like it was in the 70s, where if I showed up even to a manufacturing plant, I may be able to provide a middle-class life for myself and my family. But then if that stops working, then we need to start thinking differently about how the labor market functions.
Through this innovation.
Yeah.
So essentially what you're making the case for is education and job training for grown-ups.
No.
No?
No, I think that won't matter, right? What are you going to go back and learn to do?
What it takes, right? I mean, whether it's finance, whether it's software programming.
Finance, that's the easiest thing. You just take the data and have it spit out whatever you need.
Retrain, reskill, higher productivity work, economy grows, all is well, right? You remember that from macroeconomics, that you got to be in, and then forgot? That's fine. I got an A. So that is what the macroeconomics textbook says. And then it turns out in real life, when you go look at the numbers of what happened to manufacturing workers in Michigan or Indiana, 40 to 44% of them left the workforce and were never heard from again. Now, how did they survive? About half of that group filed for disability. There are now more Americans on disability than work in construction. 20% of working age adults in some parts of the country. And if you go to these communities, you can see it. There are just a lot of people on disability. Now, are they genuinely disabled? Yeah, a lot of them had genuine injuries, because if you're working in a manufacturing plant for 12 years, you probably have something messed up. But would they prefer to be working? In most cases, yeah. And so what happened to the manufacturing workers is almost certain to happen to the truckers. It's like there is going to be no magical realignment. You're not going to take 500,000 middle-aged men and turn them into coders or whatever ridiculous fantasy someone is peddling. And the other aspect of it too is that it's like, why on earth do you think you're supposed to try and turn a truck driver into a software engineer? Reflect on that for a moment. And the reason is that we define ourselves by economic value at this point. It's like, if you don't have any economic value, then we have to turn you into something that does, even if it makes no sense in the world to think that we can do it. And when I went to Washington, D.C. with a set of issues, so I'm a pretty cool guy, so I went to D.C. and was meeting with various legislators and policymakers, because I was an Obama appointee. I was an honorary ambassador of entrepreneurship. I have some stories to tell, but what can I tell? I'll tell a stupid story just because I found it funny. So I'm in the White House with Daniel Lubetzky, the CEO of Kind bars, little snacks. And someone's like, I'm hungry. And then I kid you not, he opens his jacket like this, like he's Batman. And he has Kind bars all over. He must have had a custom jacket made with 8 extra pockets. So he's whoa, whoa, whoa. And they're flavors you've never seen or heard of and never seen or heard of again. It wasn't here's an almond apricot. No, it was some weird flavors. Anyway, so, and then I was the only person who brought my wife. I was like, how did the rest of you stay married? This was just weird. Everyone's like, here's my comms person. I was like, here's my wife. What are you guys doing? Anyway, so I'm a cool guy. So I'm meeting with various legislators in DC being like, guys, what are we going to do? We're in the third inning of the greatest economic and technological transformation in the history of the country. What is the plan? And what do you think they said to me when I said, what is the plan? There's no plan. They looked at me like I was speaking another language. The responses I got were, we can't talk about that. We should study that. And we must educate and retrain Americans for the jobs of the future. And then I said, guys, I looked at the studies. Do you all want to guess how effective government-funded retraining programs are? 15%. Yes, 0 to 15%. We're terrible at it. And so then when I said, we're terrible at that, then the legislator would be like, well, I guess we're going to get better at it then. And then they'd just go back to their lunch. And I'd just be like, holy shit. Like, is this what passes for thinking, at this point? Are we so far gone as a country that we're not even reckoning with the fundamental changes that are devastating our communities? Yeah, that's where we are. That's totally where we are.
Right. I personally think there's going to be a greater demand in 10 years for liberal arts majors than there were for programming majors and maybe even engineering, because when the data is all being spit out for you, options are being spit out for you, you need a different perspective in order to have a different view of the data. And so having someone who's more of a freer thinker, and because if automation is being automated, you just learn the tax rules. You just feed the automation the tax rules, and it does the rest for you.
So English majors of the world should celebrate?
I think English, philosophy, foreign language majors, maybe not now, they're going to starve for a while, but that's not even the real issue, right? The real issue is if 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million people have their jobs disrupted, and we see the direction everything is going and how quickly it's going. What are you going to do with them?
So if we've moved beyond sort of the concept of free markets as places where we can alienate labor because some people are not capable of alienating their labor is just not worth anything, then is the idea that the collective owns the labor of everybody and gets to redistribute the products of that labor? Is that what we're talking about here? Because it gets into dicey territory.
No, and I agree with that. And that's actually the outcome we have to avoid, if at all possible. And this is one reason why my flagship proposal is we give every American $1,000 a month free and clear, and that doesn't somehow usurp your labor, your time. That actually, if anything, liberates your labor, your time. That if you have a little bit more freedom from scarcity, then you can start making moves towards the sort of work that you want for yourself, that you value, that you would find fulfilling and exciting.
Right. And so what I've said to the administration, and I've volunteered to help, and look, I've told his assistant, not President Trump directly, I've told people around him, I told people I know, look, I may disagree with 99% of what the guy does and how he does it, but I'm an American citizen first and last, and so I'll help wherever I can, and I want him to be successful. But what I've told them and have repeated multiple times is there's a program called AmeriCorps. Right, and AmeriCorps right now has a year of service, and it pays kids, $12,000, and they go do socially impactful things, but they live 9 people in the house, right, and that's how they're able to afford it. That's not going to cut it anymore. Those same programs, instead of having a $1.2 billion budget, needs to be a $15 or $20 billion budget, and that amount needs to be $30,000 a year, and that displaced worker in Beattyville, Kentucky, can go around teaching kids to read as part of the AmeriCorps program, and there can be 20 in Beattyville, there can be 1 million in New York City, or New York State, whatever it may be, and that's what they're doing, right? They're going out and having a social impact. It's almost like the Tennessee Valley Authority, where there was make work and building
WPA
a dam.
programs.
Yeah.
Because AmeriCorps it was closely modeled on Peace Corps, right? Same idea,
but for domestic, right. But having people come in and have a social impact and making it a real job, like you said, the WPA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, right? That's what we're going to need, and he doesn't see that. And so if you don't start, maybe he'll learn it. Maybe maybe I don't know what's going on, and maybe I'm misevaluating his ability to absorb this stuff.
Well, make America great again. Make America great. Something it isn't necessarily backwards looking. Make it great again is.
Yeah, but deal with the issues. Regardless of how you want to brand it, you got to deal with the issues, and the issues are the nature of work is changing. Automation is being automated. What looked like a great job graduating from college today may not be a great job graduating from college 5 years or 10 years from now. Having had a great job programming for the last 15 years, being a Python expert and integrating to this and that, might have been a great job for those 15 years, you might be out of work in 5 years. And I know I'm being kind of fatalistic on this, and hopefully I'm wrong, but in the event that there's a greater than 0% chance I'm right, somebody's got to start dealing with this stuff and recognize it and dealing with the macro issues. And to me, it's one of the most critical issues from a job perspective that we face, and he just doesn't get it.
You called yourself the opposite of Donald Trump, an Asian man who likes math.
Yeah, and math is an acronym. It stands for Make America Think Harder. We have to start actually thinking about the real problems and not lapsing into the fairy tales that unfortunately we're being told by the current president.
Well, I think there's a lot of voices on a stage. I think yours is such an important voice because I think you're raising issues that nobody else is talking about, and you're looking at it from a perspective that nobody else is really looking at it. I mean, I feel like at times you're taking a kind of a bird's eye view and saying, wait a minute, we're all just on this stage and wearing makeup and talking points and missing out on all these huge things which are about to hit us in the head.
Yeah, and spending 7 years in places like Detroit and Cleveland and St. Louis, like I saw the ground zero of what's happened to so many of these communities in the aftermath of the automation of these manufacturing jobs. And the retraining programs that were put in place were largely ineffective. When I dug into the numbers, almost half of the manufacturing workers here in Michigan that lost their jobs to automation left the workforce. And then of that group, about half filed for disability. And then you saw surges in suicides and drug overdoses and social ills.
And why are the programs so ineffective, the retraining programs?
The truth is that human beings are not infinitely malleable or adaptable. I mean, I was at a truck stop in Iowa the other week, and if you tried to sell retraining to that group of truckers, they'd be more likely to punch you in the face than eagerly sign up. Like human beings are just not widgets.
Right.
And if you think about the people you know, the people in your life, maybe your parents, and you were to say, hey, like reinvent yourself, it's a very, very tall order for many.
I would not be able to reinvent. I have no actual skill, so I could not be retrained to do anything other than this. Speaking of which, I got to take a quick break. But see, this is not a skill that's applicable in any other way.
Do you think we saw anything different from the last president?
Yeah, I mean, look, they came out with a paper saying a lot of these same things. And so, yeah, I mean, look, for all President Obama's faults, at least he made the effort to learn. I mean, when he first came out, when Obama was first elected, I was tearing him apart. I was tearing him apart on the SEC, what he was doing for entrepreneurs or lack thereof, the fact that, it seemed to be that everything got tougher for entrepreneurs and business. And you can go back in my blog, and I had no problems tearing him apart, just like I have no problems now. But to Obama's credit, he brought me in, even though I was being chased by the SEC, and he didn't commit to do anything and didn't change anything, but at least he listened, and he responded in a manner that made me think he understood. And he also brought in not just me, but tech guy after tech guy after tech guy to try to understand all these things.
Well, Megyn Kelly was there in the White House.
Megyn Kelly.
Straight out, someone you know
Megan Smith,
a long time.
Megan Smith,
sorry.
yeah.
Megyn Smith there from Google, someone
Brilliant,
who both know really
brilliant
well.
woman, right? And she's way ahead of the curve, right? And they were all very clear that this was a coming problem. Now, did he come up with a solution? No. Did he come up with a paper? Yes. Now, one, is not any better than the other, but at least it was there. And I don't get the sense from looking at President Trump that these have even crossed his mind. I have yet to have somebody say to me, you know what, he's been able to go in depth and convey a deep understanding of A, B, or C. Superficial, headline porn, right? I'm great, self-promotion, yeah, but at some point you got to, and I said this to him directly, at some point you have to learn the issues and you have to have the ability to convey an understanding because that builds confidence around you.
What was your line to me a few months ago? It was rare in public life you see someone get stupid over time.
Right, yeah. And
I'm just quoting you.
Yeah, and stupid is actually a word just to, yeah, because he got so, when I would talk to Donald Trump on the phone at the beginning, not one time did he say, we're starting a movement. Not one time did he say, there's a groundswell, I feel it, I'm going in this direction. It was like, we'll see what happens.
You say we need to do the opposite of what we are doing right now. In what way? What do you mean?
So Donald Trump came and said, look, there are all these problems in our communities, and so what we need to do is we need to turn the clock back, we need to bring the old jobs back, we need to build a wall, and I'm saying we need to do the opposite of all of these things. We need to turn the clock forward, We need to evolve in the way we see work and value in our society. And we need to stop trying to bring the old jobs back. We have to start putting more value into Americans' hands so that we can start creating the jobs of the future.
I thought it was so interesting. You said, that, and I want to make sure I don't get it wrong, about changing the measurements of the 21st century economy. What you were talking about, sort of how do we treat our kids, what family members who are working inside the home, the value that we place on that, what would that do? I mean, what would be the purpose of that, other than it makes sense and it's, rational as a human being, as an economic thing, why is that important?
It's crucial. Even the person who invented GDP 100 years ago, Simon Kuznets, said 3 things. He said, 1, there's a terrible measurement for national well-being and we should never use it as that. He also said we should include parenthood and motherhood because they're so important. And the 3rd thing he said was that we shouldn't include military defense spending in the calculation because it adds no economic value. So of course we've ignored all 3 of those things, and now we're writing GDP off a cliff. GDP's at record highs while our life expectancy is going down. And so if you see that this divergence is happening, then you have to line up your measurements so that it actually reflects how we are doing.
Well, you're almost, I mean, like in Bhutan, they have a national happiness index. Is that what you're kind of talking about?
So the goal is to build a scorecard, what I call the American scorecard, and GDP is still one element of it, but you also have our health and life expectancy, our mental health and freedom from substance abuse, our environmental quality, childhood success measurements. And then if someone decides to, let's say, step away from the workforce and nurture their child, that's not an economic sacrifice, that's actually an investment in our future. The same thing if there's a teacher who's doing great work in the classroom, instead of them saying you're a cost, say actually the value they're creating is massive because they might help 30 kids that year develop and become stronger. So if you change your measurements, you actually can reorganize our economy. And we have to do that because artificial intelligence coming that's going to be very, very tough to compete with on the numbers.
I was just talking to the Gateses, and one of the things they stress is that the best investment you can possibly make is investing in children and their education, and just dollar for dollar, it is the best investment anybody can make.
Yeah, and this is something I didn't get to say on the debate stage, but 2/3 of our kids' academic performance is determined by outside of school factors. So that's parental time with the child at home, that's stress levels in the house, that's the type of neighborhood. And educators know this. Educators know that they can control about 1/3 of kids' academic performance and 2/3 is determined outside of school. So if we want to get serious about giving our kids a chance to learn, we would put resources directly into the family's hands and into the homes to decrease the stress levels, get the number of words read to the kid when they're young up, and that would give our kids an actual chance to learn and our teachers an actual chance to educate.
Is that why you're talking about giving $1,000? And explain why giving $1,000?
Cash to every American. Because if you look at it, we spend by international standards a pretty good amount of money in our schools, and yet we don't see the performance improvements that we want to see. And the reason for that is that we're channeling resources into something that controls 35% of the kids' educational outcomes, and then we're ignoring the 65%, which is, again, parental time, number of words read to the child. Like, you have to get resources into the family to actually change the kids' outcomes in a meaningful way in many, many cases.
So, but I think all you're saying is really interesting. If you are president, what does that actually look like? I mean, what then are you actually
going to do?
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. The great thing is it's going to be very straightforward for me to go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, very old and archaic, hasn't been updated in decades, so we're going to update it to the American scorecard that includes these other measurements that are incredibly important to us, make a lot of sense to the American people, put more money in the hands of families.
But if there's this American scorecard where how you treat your kids and what time you spend with your kids and the educational outcomes of them, how does that impact anybody's life?
Behavior in life. All right.
As a society writ large.
Well, so the first thing is at the State of the Union every year, I would actually report on how we're doing by the real measurements. I'd be the first president to use a PowerPoint deck and say, look, here are the actual measurements for how our kids are doing, how our environment is developing, how our mental health is, and then you can actually invest and try and make resources. The trick, Anderson, is to try to tie corporate incentives to these measurements. So that right now, if you're a big company and you decide to do something positive in the community, it's just PR, and then you say, look at this great stuff I did. But if you can then demonstrate, it's like, hey, I made these kids demonstrably stronger, then they can actually get a tax credit for that, they can get economic credit for that. That's the only way we're going to align the incentives to our own well-being. Because again, right now, GDP and capital efficiency are heading in one direction, and our health and well-being are heading in another.
I feel like I understand only about a quarter of what you're saying, but I find that quarter incredibly interesting.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so I'm just acknowledging my own stupidity and your intelligence. I know others have a question as well.
No,
but
well, I'm interested in the automation issue because I think there are huge things going on, and you've said so, that really almost don't get discussed in this debate. We're discussing an economy that's vanished, and we heard a lot of discussion about trade tonight. How much is employment at risk to trade policies as compared to with automation and the threats that automation poses to jobs that exist today?
When I ran the numbers here in Michigan and in the industrial Midwest, about 80% of the job loss was due to automation and machines, and 20% was due to trade and globalization. So automation is the bigger threat. And some of the examples I use that Americans can understand, 30% of our stores and malls are closing, and it's the most common job in the economy to be a cashier or retail worker. The average retail cashier is a 39-year-old woman making between $9 and $10 an hour. So you don't think of that as an automation thing, and that it's not like a robot came into the store and started, taking orders. But if you go to the Amazon fulfillment center that is closing all these stores and malls, it's wall-to-wall machines and robots.
Can I ask a question? So the automation issue, super important. It is coming. It's not slowing down. So the question is, for the big tech, what are the sort of policy guardrails that should be put around this? I mean, you're not going to be a Luddite. You're not going to stop it.
No.
So how do you protect people? Or how do you allow them to use the technology in order to enhance themselves if training and reskilling themselves is not necessarily the answer?
There are a number of prominent technologists who've supported my campaign and embraced it. And certainly one big principle is that we all need to share in the gains. So that if you have Amazon, this trillion-dollar tech company, you have to give a tiny slice of every Amazon sale, and ideally every Facebook ad, every Google search, every Uber truck mile, and put it in our hands and help us build these economies that work in our communities.
Meaning more than universal basic income, separate from that, or is that what you're talking about?
Oh, I'm talking about universal basic income, the freedom dividend primarily, but there are other ways too.
Let me just say a couple things. One is just, I cannot tell you how happy I am that you're in this race.
Been on
No, I'm serious. And the reason for that
he has been talking about you for
listen,
Yeah.
the reason for that is
Long
two
time.
things, and they're important things. One is, in a crisis, if you get the right answer to the wrong question, you still die. We don't ask the right question, so we spend all this time, trying to get the right answer, sometimes to the wrong question. I think when you point out, and I say this to the Black Lives Matter folks all the time, I'm concerned about the racists. I'm much more concerned about the robots. The robots are going to do much more damage to your community than the racists on any given Sunday, and we're not focused on it. So you bringing this out into the mainstream and making it part of the conversation is so important. I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate you.
We got to wrap
Yeah,
up
gang.
here. Mr. Yang, thank you very much. Appreciate it.